Sarah twisted the ring on her finger. The gold band, once gleaming with promise, now felt like a dead weight against her skin. She'd barely glanced in the mirror lately, afraid she might not like what she saw. A stranger with tired eyes and a faded smile stared back at her. Weeks melted into each other. Work, a few half-hearted chores after Mark left, then the dull thud of the TV remote against the couch. Marriage shouldn't feel this flat, should it? Then that stupid work conference. She'd almost spilled coffee on Alex. Tall, unfairly handsome with an easy grin, that jolt of something, the way he'd said no worries, had stayed with her all week. Absurd. What are you getting all dolled up for? Mark had asked as she swiped on lipstick. Just a slightly brighter shade, nothing bold. Out for coffee, work thing, networking, she'd muttered. Pathetically transparent. Mark hadn't seemed to notice, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. The cafe was crowded, too noisy. Alex spotted her and his grin spread. He had that kind of smile that made everyone else in the room seem unimportant. Her cheeks flushed. She hoped it looked professional, not like a nervous schoolgirl. Networking, huh? Alex teased, settling into the seat across from her. Guess this beats some boring slide presentation. Her laugh felt too loud. Those can be brutal, she admitted. They talked shop for a bit, then Alex leaned in slightly. So, what about the real you, Sarah? What lights your fire? She hesitated. Did she even remember the real her anymore? The safe answer would be predictable hobbies, maybe a cliché about loving long walks with Mark. Instead, she blurted out, honestly, lately nothing, it's like... She trailed off, then took a risk. It's like I'm on autopilot. Alex's smile faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite read. I get that, he said softer. Ever wonder if there's more? Something out there you haven't even glimpsed yet? The conversation danced on that edge, thrill mixed with something close to danger. They both knew they were getting close to a line. Sarah glanced at her watch, feeling a mix of panic and a strange sort of freedom. I gotta run, but hey, don't be a stranger at the next conference, she said, her voice slightly breathless. Alex just nodded, but something in his eyes sent a shiver down her spine. Had she imagined that flash of heat, or had it echoed the thrill she was desperately trying to ignore? The next day, every email felt like it was from Alex. Every phone buzz sent her stomach churning. Was he thinking about her too? The idea was crazy, thrilling, and a little bit terrifying. At lunch, she caught herself staring at her boring sandwich and picturing Alex's smirk instead. Work dragged on. She couldn't even fake interest in the project meeting. Her colleagues' chatter sounded far away, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. She slipped out early, lying about a headache. Home alone, the silence pressed in, suffocating. She paced, restless. It was wrong, all of it. But what was worse, admitting she'd become a stranger to herself. Or the jolt of excitement every time she thought about Alex. Mark wouldn't be back for hours. One text wouldn't hurt, right? Drinks to shake off this workday? Just a friendly thing, she typed, then hit delete. It was pathetic, a schoolgirl with a crush. After an agonizing 10 minutes, she settled for a watered-down version. Crazy week. How about a quick drink later? His reply was almost immediate. Absolutely. Usual place, 7. A wave of guilt crashed over her. What was she doing? But the guilt warred with an electrifying thrill she hadn't felt in years. She took a deep breath and sent back a simple, see you then. Getting dressed was a blur. Should she change? Look nicer? Act casual? No, that would be too obvious. Yet she lingered over her makeup a bit longer, just a hint of boldness she normally wouldn't dare. At the bar, Alex was already there. The sight of him, the casual way he leaned back, that familiar spark in his eyes, made her excuses feel flimsy. Rough week, huh? He asked, sliding her a glass of wine. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. You have no idea, she muttered. You want to tell me about it? His voice was low, a hint of something more than friendly curiosity. For a second she almost did, almost blurted out the truth. How trapped she felt, how desperate she was for something, but she just shrugged. It's dumb, married stuff, you wouldn't get it. She forced a light chuckle, and was relieved when Alex dropped the subject. The rest of the evening was a strange mix. Guilt gnawed at her, but also a defiant little flicker deep down. Was it wrong to just feel good for a little while? Emergency client report. Sarah lied to Mark, her voice too high-pitched. Boss is freaking out. He barely looked up from his book, just grunted. Don't stay too late, okay? She met Alex in the dimly lit parking garage. His car seemed like a whole other world, smelling of expensive cologne and a kind of freedom she didn't have anymore. They drove to a generic hotel on the edge of town, the kind you'd only notice if you were looking for it. Work thing, huh? Alex chuckled as the elevator doors slid shut. Gotta keep up appearances, she mumbled. Inside the room, the pretense dissolved. Hours melted into each other. Stolen touches, shared whispers, a desperation that went beyond just physical. Back home, she fell into bed next to Mark, his warmth a painful contrast to the lingering heat of Alex's skin on hers. Shame flooded her, but the excitement warred with it, buzzing under her skin like she was coming down from something potent. The text started the next day. Coded jokes, innocent-looking emojis that held a thrill just between them. Sarah became obsessed, phone always in hand, heart pounding every time it buzzed. Mark seemed oblivious. She told herself it was pity more than love that made his tired smile hurt so much. Their second meeting was bolder. A kiss in the quiet back corner of a coffee shop. A rush of danger that sent them stumbling out like teenagers. That kiss changed everything. Excuses piled up. Late meetings, surprise work trips. Mark seemed to accept them, a dullness in his eyes that twisted something deep inside her. She clung to the nights with Alex, their cheap hotel rooms transformed into a desperate, passionate little world. The risks got bigger, the lies more tangled. Lying in bed, the weight of it became too much. She almost reached for Mark, the words, "I have to tell you something," bubbling up. Instead, she rolled over and pictured Alex's face. Sleep, when it finally came, was ragged and haunted. Mark's sad eyes accusing. Alex's whispered promises twisting into something mocking. When she woke, exhausted, the craving for Alex had already won. Sarah had planned it all out. On Mark's birthday, she'd sit him down, tears streaming, the whole "it's not you, it's me" routine. Then she would break free, honest and guiltless, ready to start a new life with Alex. But at dinner, Mark smiled at her. A genuine smile, like he used to before everything got so grey. His gift, a book she'd mentioned in passing weeks ago, made her throat tighten. How could she do this to him? "Thank you," she choked out. It felt like a lie worse than any of the fake business trips. She escaped for a long walk. Her phone buzzed. "Wish I was there to celebrate with you." Alex, of course. Anger flared. He didn't get to be sweet when he was the reason for all of this mess. But another part of her, the part she hated, craved that warmth, the feeling of being desired. That night she pushed Alex away. "I can't," she said. "This has to stop." The hurt in his eyes stung. "So what? Now you got your kicks, you're going back to hubby." "It's not that simple," she protested, too weakly for her own liking. "Sure seems that way," he snapped back. His words lingered, making her question her own motives. The next lie to Mark spilled out so easily she was terrified at how good she'd become at this. But this time she saw him hesitate. Did he sense something was off? His touch on her arm was gentle, a question in his eyes. "Let's go away. Just you and me, like we used to." His voice cracked a little on that last part. Guilt washed over her. This was what she had always wanted. A husband who cared, who was trying. Yet the image of Alex flickered at the edge of her mind, a tempting shadow she couldn't shake. The weekend getaway was a farce. Sarah faked laughter, pretended interest, all while counting the hours until she could see Alex again. She tried to make up for it, small kindnesses for Mark, hoping it would ease the shame. It didn't. "So, how do we fix this?" she blurted out to Alex in their usual hotel room. "For real, can we have a future?" He shrugged, and something in her shattered a little. "Of course not. This was fun, stolen, but it wasn't real." "Don't worry about that now," he said, kissing her neck, but it felt emptier this time. He didn't want to fix anything. He was fine with the way things were. The next morning, Alex's words lingered like a bad hangover. "I'm starting to get tired of sneaking around, Sarah. Fun as this is, I'm not the other man kind of guy." It wasn't an ultimatum, but something in it stung. Sarah, who'd always prided herself on being strong and in control, felt desperate and small. He was right. She was just his stolen time, not someone he'd build a life with. Driving home, she felt the panic rising. What if Alex ended it? The thrill of the affair dimmed, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Then she walked through the door, and the trap snapped shut again. Mark had decked out the living room. Flowers, champagne, the cheesy candles she'd always secretly mocked. Their anniversary. How had she forgotten? Her stomach churned with guilt so thick she could barely look him in the eye. Surprise! His smile was so bright, so full of hope, it made her want to scream. He pulled her into a hug, oblivious to the way she went rigid in his arms. Dinner was a blur of forced conversation and half-finished champagne. Every kind word from Mark felt like a nail hammered deeper. Images of Alex flashed in her mind, then faded into the dull ache of Mark's hand on hers across the table. Which betrayal was worse? That night, lying in bed, she stared at the darkness. The confession twisted inside her, a bitter promise. "I have to tell you," she whispered, but the empty space beside her echoed back silence. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and avoidance. Alex's texts became demanding, then petulant. She barely replied, the flame of the affair sputtering out. Mark tried even harder, small gestures of love that now felt suffocating. One evening, standing at the kitchen sink, a wave of nausea washed over her. She wasn't sick. The nausea was a bone-deep fear, the realization echoing in her head. She wasn't ready to end the affair. Not because of Alex, but because the alternative, facing Mark's devastation, facing the ruin of everything, was too much to bear. The shame burned like hot acid. She was a coward, a monster, the worst kind of cliché. Yet even as these words formed in her mind, she knew she would do it all again, lie again and again if it meant not facing the truth. It shouldn't have even happened. Alex, sloppy with his own lies, sent a text meant for someone else. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." And Mark saw it. Her fumble for a pathetic excuse about work drinks with a client died in her throat at the look on his face. "Don't insult me, Sarah." His voice was flat, so unlike his usual warmth it was like a stranger had walked into their house. "Who is he?" She sputtered denials, but there were no lies that could fix this. He didn't shout, didn't rage. He just looked at her, the light in his eyes dying, replaced by a cold disgust she'd never seen before. I can explain," she choked out. "No," he cut her off. "Don't bother. I see it all so clearly now." Tears spilled, tears of shame and terror. She launched into a barrage of half-baked apologies, promises, begging him for another chance. But he stood there, arms stiff at his sides, a wall she couldn't break through. And then the worst. "I should have listened to myself," he said, so low she almost didn't hear it. "For months a little voice told me something was wrong, but I didn't want to see it." That was worse than any screaming match. It was the proof that she'd not only destroyed his trust, she'd crushed his hope, and the realization of how deeply she'd damaged him shattered something inside her. She reached out, desperate to touch him, to prove there was still something real between them. He flinched away. The gesture, small and sharp, was the final blow. "Just go," he said. His voice broke slightly on that last word, and that nearly destroyed her more than anything else. "Mark, please," she choked out, a pathetic whimper. "No," he said again, firmer. "I can't even look at you right now. Just go." Numbly, she gathered a few things in a bag, the silence suffocating. As she walked out the door, she turned back once, hoping he might change his mind, some flicker of forgiveness. But he was already gone, the closed door echoing the finality of it all. Every thud of Mark's suitcase against the stairs was a hammer blow. It was so methodical, each item of clothing he folded with such chilling calm. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction, this was the end, decided and deliberate. "I'll be back for the rest of my things later," he said, finally looking at her. "I need to think, to process everything." His voice was devoid of anger, just bone-deep exhaustion, and somehow that emptiness was even more devastating. "Mark, please, let's talk about this. I was stupid. I'll never do it again, I swear." She knew how pathetic she sounded, how useless the words were. "Sarah," he cut her off, but gently. "There's nothing left to talk about. You made your choice." As he walked out the door, she wanted to scream, chase after him, beg at his feet, but her legs wouldn't move. The silence swallowed her whole, and with it came the gut-churning reality. She'd done this. This was her fault. The panic hit then. Alex, she had to call Alex. He would fix this, tell her everything would be okay. She fumbled for her phone, tears blurring the numbers. His voice, when he answered, was tight and unfamiliar. "Alex, it's Mark found out. Everything's blown up. Whoa, hold on, slow down. What do you mean he found out?" His tone was sharp, edged with something that wasn't concern. He saw a text, he knows. Her voice broke, replaced by a ragged sob. "Look, Sarah," Alex said, and his tone was like ice. "I never said I'd leave my wife for you, okay? This was fun, but I was never going to blow up my life for this." The word "this" hung in the air, a brutal dismissal of everything they'd had. And then he said the worst thing yet. "Honestly, Sarah, get a grip. This is your mess to deal with." Click. He hung up. She collapsed onto the floor, sobs racking her body. Alex's cruel rejection was the final nail in the coffin, the proof of her devastating isolation. She was alone. Time lost all meaning. Days melted into one another. Was this Tuesday or still Monday? Meals were forgotten, and the shower was a place she avoided because it forced her to look at her own reflection. Each unanswered text she fired off to Mark was another blow to her dwindling hope. Silence echoed back, a constant reminder that the kind, open man she once knew was gone, replaced by a stranger carved from ice. The worst were the fragments of memories that ambushed her. Laughter over a silly inside joke with Mark, a shared look of contentment over a quiet dinner. Images now poisoned by the knowledge that she'd thrown it all away. The gossip slithered in like a noxious fog. Whispers at the grocery store, a sympathetic head tilt from a once close friend who now crossed the street to avoid her. Judgment, whether real or imagined, felt like acid on raw skin. "I heard," people would start, then trail off, pretending kindness while their eyes gleamed with the salacious thrill of another's downfall. She wanted to scream that they didn't know her, that she wasn't that kind of person before. Now, she wasn't so sure anymore. Nights were an endless torture. In dreams, Mark's face twisted with fresh pain, and Alex's dismissive words echoed, "Get a grip, this is your mess." Sleep became the enemy, and exhaustion just another layer to her unending misery. Once she'd been the type with a busy social calendar, a job she enjoyed. Now every invitation felt like a landmine, and work was a special kind of hell. She'd duck into empty conference rooms, pretending to be busy, just to avoid the looks she was convinced were aimed at her. One evening, despair was a physical weight. Before thinking, she was in her car, driving to the house she'd shared with Mark. Stupid, pointless, but her loneliness outweighed any shred of logic. The lights were on, warm yellow spilling from the windows. A moving van was parked in the driveway. Through the living room window, she saw a woman laughing, reaching up to place a photo frame on the fireplace mantel. Sarah's stomach lurched. Someone else was already building a life here. A life that should have been hers. She turned away, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just the end of her marriage, it was the end of her, the person she used to be. Driving home, she felt hollowed out, a shell of a woman filled only with regret. The woman laughed again. Sarah, crouched in the shadows like a pathetic stalker, wondered what kind of joke she might be sharing. The laughter was easy, light, the kind Sarah hadn't heard in her own voice for what seemed like an eternity. Another sob tore through her, making her double over. She couldn't look anymore. Each flickering image from inside that house was a searing reminder of everything she had destroyed. A life with Mark, the stupid dream of children, even the simple promise of a cozy Sunday morning. All of it gone. She stumbled back to her car, fumbling for her keys. The phone screen glared back at her, mockingly empty. No missed calls, no texts, not even junk spam. Nothing from Mark. The silence was her constant, suffocating companion. Days later, the envelope arrived, thick, cream-colored. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Mark's lawyer, the formal letterhead, the clinical language outlining the end of their marriage. It felt less like reading and more like a verdict slamming down. "No," she choked out, crumpling the paper. Hot tears fell, making the words blur. This couldn't be real. It was just a nightmare, one she'd surely wake from any moment now. But the nightmare refused to end. Despair settled over her, heavy and suffocating. For a dangerous moment, she considered downing the bottle of 2 strong painkillers tucked in the bathroom cabinet. It would quiet the voices in her head, the endless loop of if-onlys and why did I... A sliver of instinct stopped her. Sarah wasn't sure if it was self-preservation or a pathetic animal-level desire to survive. She found a crumpled business card in her wallet, a therapist recommended by a friend months ago. Making the call felt like lifting a boulder. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, the words spilling out in a clumsy torrent of shame and half-truths. They set an appointment. Going was going to be 1,000 times worse than making the call, but it felt like the first step on a path she hadn't even been able to see before. Therapy was brutal, forcing her to look directly at the ugliness she'd become, the selfishness that had masqueraded as wanting more. Her therapist, thankfully, didn't traffic in pity or coddling excuses. Weeks became months. It was the hardest work Sarah had ever done. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no lightning bolt of absolution, just the slow, painstaking task of examining her choices and their devastating fallout. Yet something did shift. With every agonizing session, the despair lessened its grip. Tiny flickers of something that might one day resemble determination began to appear. She didn't know if she'd ever be happy or if she deserved to be. But the idea of surviving this wasn't impossible anymore. One step, then another. That was all she